Drodzy Państwo, zapraszam, nasz specjalny gość, David Capozzi.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Thank you for having me. So, I was in a car accident 40 years ago and became disabled as a result of that. And I remember having to ask, is the restaurant accessible? Is the theater accessible? Can I get into the sports arena? And having to plan in advance all the time my life. And 40 years later, I don't do that anymore. I expect the restaurant to be accessible or the sports arena to be accessible. So I don't call in advance. Our expectations have really increased over the years, partly because of, and I think mostly because of, advocacy that people with disabilities have fought for, and laws and regulations that have been instituted over the years. And so I'm going to talk about some of those, the effects of those laws and regulations and advocacy, and how progress has been made and some of the challenges that still exist. So in the US, the first accessibility standard that was issued was in 1961. So we go back, many decades. It was called the ANSI standard, and it contained only 6 pages of requirements and 2 figures. Our agency issues what's called the Architectural Barriers Act and Americans with Disabilities Act accessibility guidelines. And the current version contains 251 pages of requirements and 141 figures. So a lot of progress since 1961. We now address facilities like recreation facilities, pools, playgrounds, golf courses, miniature golf courses, boating and fishing facilities, amusement rides, so Disney, Universal Studios, courthouses and prisons. Since the first accessibility standard issued in 1961, we've seen a lot of progress. Installation of curb ramps, or what you call dropped curbs, high-low drinking fountains, playgrounds, and accessible technology. The first curb ramp was installed in a small town called Kalamazoo, Michigan in 1945 by returning World War II veterans with disabilities. And then in Urbana, Illinois in 1952, curb ramps were installed at the University of Illinois, and in Berkeley, California, home of the disability rights movement and the independent living movement, the first curb ramp was installed in the city in 1972. Today's modern curb ramps are a little easier to use, better designed, have what we call detectable warnings, the red raised domes at the bottom of the curb ramp, which I've seen throughout cities here in Poland, and audible pedestrian signals. High-low drinking fountains, introduced in 1991 with our accessibility guidelines, are now the norm. On the left is an adapted drinking fountain from the 1950s. You can see how they cobbled it together. And on the right is a standard high-low drinking fountain from any manufacturer's catalog. Playgrounds have changed remarkably. The one on the left is from the 1950s, and it's one that I can remember using when I was a child. They were made out of steel, and the surface was grass, and they were completely inaccessible to children with disabilities. And on the right is an inclusive playground with accessible equipment and surfacing made possible by regulations that our agency issued in 2000. And now I was at a meeting in Gdansk yesterday, and after leaving the meeting saw a photograph of an inclusive playground that looked very much like the one on the bottom right. So it's good to see that that is really moving around the world. We've seen a revolution in technology as well in the built environment. Since 1969, America's first ATM was installed in New York City, completely inaccessible. Today, there's almost 2 million ATMs around the world, and most have audible synthetic speech. They're within reach because of accessibility standards and advocacy by people with disabilities. But mistakes were made along the way. In 1991, when we issued our accessibility guidelines, we had a provision that said, make the ATM independently usable by people that are blind or visually impaired. Well, that wasn't specific enough. What manufacturers did was they put a big braille placard on the ATM machine, expecting that people that are blind would be able to use the machine without changing the operating system. That didn't work. It resulted in ATMs that were completely unusable. So blind advocates demanded that ATMs provide audio output. A court case held that because our guidelines were so vague and non-specific, that audio output was not required. And so in 2004, we updated our guidelines to require that at least one of each type of ATM at each location be speech-enabled, provide receipt information, have a specific keyboard layout, meet height and reach range requirements, and provide a standard headphone jack. And although the requirement became effective in March 2012, by the end of 2012, over 100,000 ATMs in the United States met our standards. The first long-distance TTY call was made in May 1964. Today, video phones are the preferred method of communication for people who are deaf. With the adoption of personal computers and DOS-based operating systems in the early 1980s, screen reader technology developed and opened up a whole new world for blind people. An article at the time stated that blind people could be found operating DOS-based systems and doing jobs like accounting and customer service. And blind people saw a whole new world open up to them. But in 1984, just 4 years later, a new way of computer interaction became available. The graphical user interface, something that we're all used to today, using a mouse or other pointing device and icons to navigate. Well, that amazing advancement for sighted people became a barrier to people who are blind or visually impaired. It resulted in technology that was previously accessible to becoming completely inaccessible. Then in 1992, the first screen reader for a graphical user interface operating system became available. But in those 8 years between the time of the graphical user interface becoming available and a screen reader becoming available, led people with disabilities to believe that their employment opportunities were going to be completely diminished. Today, we have requirements called the Section 508 standards that should make this technological disconnect harder to happen. Oops. On the left is Martin Cooper. Martin invented the cell phone in 1973, opening up telecommunications for millions while leaving millions more behind. The first cell phone was not accessible to people who are deaf or hard of hearing. And then after that, touchscreens were introduced. Now the iPhone is largely preferred by blind users because of its voiceover application and by people who use hearing aids because of its hearing aid compatibility. But the first iPhone that came out was completely inaccessible to blind individuals. That wasn't that long ago. It was in 2000. A new form of technology called real-time text is on the horizon and may ultimately replace older TTYs. And you can see it's being demonstrated that real-time text is, as you type a character, the character is being displayed at the other end, as opposed to typing the entire message and then hitting send. I can't advance. There we go. Accessible technology has also increased mobility for people with physical disabilities. George Klein, a Canadian, is credited with designing the first wheelchair, power wheelchair, in the early 1950s. And on the right, today's wheelchairs are a bit more contemporary. All right, something. Yeah. Thank you. Led by the ADA and its regulations, we have seen even more remarkable progress in accessible transportation. Walter Callow, a Canadian blind quadriplegic veteran, invented the first wheelchair accessible bus in 1947. There you go, on the left. And in 1952, we saw the first accessible fixed route bus system at the University of Illinois on the right. Mr. Callow took his first and only ride after his death when his body was transported for his funeral. Transportation accessibility was improved through civil disobedience as well. A group of advocates who bring attention to the lack of civil rights for people with disabilities called ADAPT got its start in Denver, Colorado in 1983 when they protested over the lack of accessible public transportation. When ADAPT was successful in getting accessible transportation through the Americans with Disabilities Act, they changed their name from Americans Disabled for Accessible Public Transportation to Americans Disabled for Attendant Programs Today. And in 1979, Seattle Metro led the United States when they began ordering buses with some of the first wheelchair lifts in the country. And since 2003, all their new buses are low floor to speed boarding and exiting. So let me just show you the effects of some laws, regulations, and policy. On this screen, it shows you that the percentage of accessible vehicles. In 1990, the year the ADA was passed, about 40% of public buses in the United States were accessible. Today, it's almost 100%, 99.6%. And that's because we said, as you go forward, as you buy new vehicles, every new vehicle has to be accessible. And buses don't last forever, and so over time, they became completely accessible. Many barriers still exist at rail stations because of a lack of level boarding. These photos show Amtrak's new design for a gap filler for high-level platforms, but it's only been installed at one station so far. And many tools are used to accelerate progress in accessibility. One is how we describe and promote accessibility through symbols. The International Symbol of Accessibility was created by a Danish design student in 1968 and modified shortly thereafter by adding a circle to the top of the seated figure. Today, there's a movement to redesign the symbol. On the left is a new symbol developed by a project called the Accessible Icon Project in Massachusetts, and it's been embraced by a new law in New York State. On the right is one of the designs from a contest launched a few years ago by the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario and the Ontario College of Arts and Design. it hasn't been so warmly embraced. In the 1950s, the University of Illinois engaged in research on ramp slope and materials. Research was conducted on what they called the ramp to nowhere. So you can see this ramp just kind of goes off and then ends. Researchers changed the slope and length by raising or lowering the ramp and pounding pegs in pre-drilled holes in the vertical posts. And about 75 students in wheelchairs were tested using the ramp. Today's research is a little bit more robust. The University of Buffalo conducted one of the world's most robust accessibility research projects in recent memory that we funded. And the project collected and analyzed data from almost 500 individuals in mobility devices and compared those findings to those in 3 other countries and to the current standards in those countries and in the US. Progress can also be seen in awareness raising. In Buffalo, New York, there's a Museum of Disability History. And in Washington, at the National Museum of American History, there's an online museum called Everybody, an artifact of disability in America. And when I was in Gdynia, I was exposed to a new museum called the Museum Without Exception that focused on accessibility issues for people with disabilities. So despite all the progress we've seen over the years, challenges remain. Some involve compliance with existing laws and regulations, such as taxi cab accessibility, maintaining lifts and ramps. I experienced that firsthand on your high-speed rail over the last few days, and announcing transit stops. And one persistent challenge is our inner-city rail system we call Amtrak. Amtrak was given the longest time to comply with the ADA, 20 years. So now it's 27 years after the ADA. 10% of their stations are accessible 27 years later. So that's a big challenge that still remains. New challenges exist as well with areas that are not regulated so well, like taxi cab accessibility, made even more difficult now in the US with the advent of ride-sharing services like Uber and Lyft that don't have accessible vehicles and rely on others to provide accessibility. As we've seen in the past, with the rush to advanced technology, it has the potential to leave people behind. And we're seeing that today as well with challenges to making electronic instructional materials for students with disabilities accessible, and the advent of inaccessible touchscreens, which are everywhere. Other challenges, such as access to exercise equipment, prescription drug labels, access into single-family dwelling units, exist as well. So despite all the progress, we still have a lot more work to do. And we need advocates and promoters of accessibility to enforce the laws and regulations that have been fought for and to help prevent new barriers from occurring. So what lessons have we learned in the US from our over 40 or 50 years of experience about how to effectively legislate, regulate, and enforce accessibility? First, make requirements measurable. That's real important, not to just have a general performance standard saying make something accessible or make a doorway wide enough. How wide is wide enough? You have to be specific. Assign time frames for progress. You know, as I've already said about Amtrak, we gave them time, but it's important to provide a time frame and then hold people's feet to the fire and then enforce accessibility afterwards. Require public involvement in the development of requirements, standards, regulations. We've done that as an agency. We've formed 14 advisory committees over the years involving over 350 different organizations. And these groups then become ambassadors for accessibility because they were involved in the process. So it's important to have them involved. Have strong enforcement requirements. A law without a way to enforce it is no law at all. and make new construction to be accessible. Have a requirement that everything built new or everything purchased new be accessible. And finally, be patient. Progress takes time. So thank you very much.
Dziękujemy. No, to teraz czas na ten dialogowy moment. Ręka do góry, ja podbiegam z mikrofonem. Pytania spokojnie w języku polskim możemy zadawać, tak będzie wygodniej.
Dzień dobry, Monika Jankowska-Rangelow. Ja mam takie pytanie dotyczące świadomości pracodawców w Stanach Zjednoczonych. Jak to wygląda, jeśli chodzi o zatrudnienie osób z niepełnosprawnościami na otwartym rynku pracy? Bo oczywiście są firmy, które są świetnie do tego przygotowane i się specjalizują w zatrudnianiu osób tylko albo przeważnie z niepełnosprawnościami, ale jak to wygląda na rynku otwartym?
So that's another example of bad news. Before the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed in 1990, 2/3 of adults with disabilities were unemployed. Today, 2/3 of adults with disabilities are unemployed. So 27 years later, we haven't seen much progress in employment. We've seen some progress in employment of people with disabilities in the federal government. In the last administration, there was an executive order that encouraged agencies to hire up to 100,000 new employees with disabilities, and that was met. But in the private sector, challenges still remain. And I think that there are many reasons for that. There are disincentives to work, which are systemic, attitudinal barriers. But physical accessibility is good, and technology is good. So those aren't really excuses. One of the things that we've found, though, over the years is that, so we require when a person is employed that a reasonable accommodation be provided. And most accommodations cost nothing. So it costs nothing to maybe modify a person's schedule or provide more time for a task. Those accommodations that cost something, on the average, cost less than $500. So accommodations really tend not to be a barrier either. But there's still progress to be made in that area.
Już podchodzę.
Janusz Narcyz z Platformy Integracji Osób Niepełnosprawnych. Ja chciałem pana zapytać, bo te dane, które pan podał dotyczące aktywności zawodowej osób niepełnosprawnych, no, są dosyć zatrważające, aczkolwiek one w wymiarze światowym są podobne. Tak samo mamy w Polsce. I pytanie jest takie, czy zdaniem pana ten niski poziom aktywności osób niepełnosprawnych, czy zawodowej, czy zatrudnieniowej, to jest efekt lęku pracodawców, żeby nawiązać do dzisiejszego seminariów, czy to jest efekt leżący raczej po stronie osób niepełnosprawnych? A my w Polsce też mamy problem z ogromną biernością zawodową osób niepełnosprawnych. Dziękuję.
I think it might be a little bit of both. So I have a friend who's since passed away, extremely qualified attorney, went to Harvard Law School, wound up eventually being appointed by President Clinton as a commissioner to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, very high level position. But when he graduated from law school, he got 0 offers because he was a person of short stature and whenever he would walk into an interview, you know, stigma, I think, was one of the biggest barriers that he faced. So I think it's a little bit of both. I think there are still areas of stigma and discrimination. And on the other hand, I think that there are still some disincentives for people with disabilities to work through social programs that we have. But that's not to say that many people with disabilities are not fully engaged and employed in really creative jobs. So I don't want to put a wet blanket on the employment prospects. I think we've made a lot of progress. It's just that that's a really tough issue to crack.
Widziałam przed momentem drugą rękę razem z panem podniesioną, ale teraz nie wiem, gdzie to było. Czy są jeszcze jakieś pytania? Bo mamy czas na pytania.
Skorzystam z okazji, że nie ma innych pytań. Chciałabym zapytać, tak z pana perspektywy, co możemy zrobić jako społeczeństwo, czy też pracodawcy, żeby zachęcić osoby z niepełnosprawnościami do tego, żeby lepiej były przygotowane do podjęcia aktywności zawodowej. Co pan uważa osobiście mogłoby być takim argumentem w tej dyskusji, żeby przekonać osobę z niepełnosprawnością, że warto podejmować aktywność zawodową?
Right. Yeah. So I remember when I was newly disabled, I was a recipient of rehabilitation services that helped pay for my